turn of events. And so we wanted to add some clarity to what happened in education committee and why there is this, all this, I guess, turbulence after the House adopted the science standards. So they adopted the science standards, but they didn't approve the content. And so for the average everyday person, the content essentially is telling the teachers what to teach, how to teach, and the curriculum.
Right.
So we wanted to clarify that is, so the issue for us, I think everybody on this call, is that is not the legislature's duty. That duty resides at the local district with local school boards and parents.
Right.
So that was the first issue that we wanted to clarify.
Okay. And what we're hearing in the media all over is that there's nothing about the content being put into law. They don't talk about that part of it at all. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's been a lot of focus and emphasis put on how backwards Idaho people are and how, we're not wanting to teach, the
real science.
The consensus in
yeah.
science, which
yeah.
Last time I looked, there was no consensus actually in science because science was actually science. So,
right.
And then they focused on other things, like we didn't have any verbs in our old science standards, which was just not true at all. And so, so someone that wants us to adopt these standards in whole as a big chunk is trying to maneuver the conversation away from what the actual issue is.
Right.
So, so now it's going to head to the Senate. And so that's why we wanted to have this conversation so that we could dispel some of the misinformation that's coming out.
Exactly. And I wanted to just throw in one other thing, because we kept hearing that the last time Idaho Science Standards were reviewed or revised or what have you, wasn't it like they said 2001, something along those lines, but that's not actually the case. They're not that old. So I think what was it, 2009 or 2011, something like that?
2009 is when so if we didn't adopt these standards, then we would actually go back to the standards that were used in 2009.
Okay.
So, but also on that point, when Melissa Farrow testified to the House Education Committee, she actually said she herself had been using these standards that she wanted to have voted on. She'd been using them in her classroom. And I think she said for 3 years.
Oh, wow.
So, so it's kind of a silly argument because
if she's using them.
Yeah, she's already using them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just start. So we have some points that we're wanting to cover. So do you want to just lead us into our first point?
Yeah, I think we kind of covered that just in the opening statement. And
okay.
So for us as parents, it really comes down to trying to make sure that the legislature stays in their lane.
Right, right.
So their lane is not adopting curriculum and content for local school districts. So I think that's our first point. The second point we're going to cover and go over is that this is not Idaho Science Standards. That's one of the biggest lies that was perpetuated. These are next generation science standards. And then we'll go over the Fordham report and then show you how the other states standards compared in science. Mm-hmm. And then I think we'll go over a little bit at the end, what is lacking and why it's not adequate for STEM.
Okay. So let's jump into that next point then. So I know, Stephanie Gifford, you have looked at you've looked at the NGSS, right? And you've looked at the Idaho standards, and what did you find on that?
They are cut and paste copies. The ones that I didn't look at every single one, but the ones that I did look at were all, the actual title of the standard, the numbers were flipped around a little bit, but the content of the standard was completely identical to the next generation science standards.
And that's what I found too. I did a cross comparison of both of them. And yeah, I mean, word for word, pretty much, there's nothing different in them. And that was one of my questions that I couldn't get answered at the science committee with a few other people was, okay, if these were Idaho standards, who did it? Who wrote these? How did they organically happen? And no one has been able to give me an answer on that. They just say, oh, well, we had all these educators that came together and they sat down and went over things. Well, I'm like, no, that they didn't, because these are exactly what the NGSS are.
And I think also it's important to mention that for those of us that have been paying attention to the education reforms and saw these coming and expected them to show up in our legislators' hands, that these are written by the same people that wrote Common Core math and English standards, and they are also copyrighted. So, so I'm not really sure that we had much wiggle room to change, amend, whatever. And we were very limited in what we could do with the other standards. So I'm sure that these were probably not that much different.
Yeah. Okay.
The other thing I noticed looking through them is that they all have links to which English and math standards of the Common Core standards they integrate with. And so not only were they written by the same people, but they are made to integrate along with the other Common Core standards.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, that is a good point. Perfect.
And so I also wanted to bring up, if anyone doubts that these are next generation science standards, we actually have some audio which we're going to try and get to the Senate Education Committee. The House Education Committee got it, but we'll try and get it to the Senate, which the science director, Mr. Smith, is on there saying that luckily they renamed these Idaho Science Standards and not NGSS.
That's crazy.
Idaho is not the only state to have done that, though. Utah, when they adopted them, there was like one word changed, and they decided because of that one word they could call them Utah Science Standards. But yeah, it's kind of the same MO.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to admit that these are not their own state standards.
Right.
So,
and if you look at them, if you actually look at them and compare them, there's not that much difference. They're exactly the same.
Yeah.
But they're selling them that they're Idaho standards. And so to me, with the testimonies that were given when they were talking to the committees, they're telling them that these are Idaho standards. And so they're trying to get them to adopt these on a false pretense that these are Idaho state standards, which they're not.
Yeah. And that's also a good point. I mean, we actually were paying really close attention to the media and to the testimony, and actually went back through committee meeting minutes from the past years and put together a few documents that kind of spell out, and I just have to call them lies. I mean, honestly, they're just simply untruths, and it's misinformation. And so these people that are supposed to be our elected and our state employed and our appointeds are simply giving misinformation to get something passed. And as a taxpayer, I want standards that would stand on their own merit, and
Right.
it wouldn't have to be, cloaked in darkness and secrecy and misinformation.
Exactly. Nope, that's a good point. Yep. And that's not what's happening. Okay, so what's our next point?
The next one is we wanted to go over the Fordham report.
Yes.
So,
yeah. You have that up, don't you, Mila?
Yep, I do have it up on my computer screen now. And we actually have that linked on a couple places on the Idahoans for Local Education website that you can see, or you can just Google it.
Okay.
But one of the arguments is we need higher standards, we need better standards. And so when you go to the Fordham report, when they compared across all the states, the next generation science standards are in there, and they are literally rated a C. And they're rated on the lower end of the C with a 5, not a 6. And there were actually many states that had much higher standards. It looks like we have about 8 that were actually A or A minus. So in my mind, why don't Idaho students deserve proven standards that were, it says in their own rubric that they were clearly superior?
Yeah. Why are we adopting standards that are average or, low compared to those other states that had higher standards? And Fordham, can you give us does anybody have a little bit of background on who they are, how they work? They're pretty much a bipartisan organization, right? That they take a look at
educational.
Yeah. And so they went through all the states, looked at their science standards. They had different criterias that they were rating them on. And then they came up with grades and kind of a summary of each of the states and what science standards they had and what they found within those science standards. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
And I mean, the NGSS they did rate those higher than Idaho standards, but I mean, I think for the amount of money that we're going to pay as taxpayers to align our curriculum and our whatever else and teacher trainings and whatnot, and not to mention the time and energy and money we've spent on all this stuff anyways to try and get them passed, it just seems silly. Seems silly.
Yeah. Exactly.
And there's the assessment piece as well. I still haven't heard much about how they will be assessed, what that will cost, all of that.
That's
as
true.
well.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. That's a whole other video.
Yes.
That is true. Perfect.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny. It's like a big race to the middle.
Right.
And then the last point that we wanted to cover really quickly, so we don't make the video too long, was there's a lot of people across the nation that have written a lot of stuff on how the next generation science standards are actually very lacking and don't seem to align very well with our STEM mission.
Yeah.
In fact, there are a lot of science teachers and science experts that say it totally leaves our students unprepared for this STEM careers and that we've been moving, everything right now seems to be about STEM, science, technology, engineering and math, but our science standards are moving in the opposite direction.
Right. Why would we do that?
Yeah.
If we're trying to prepare kids for these STEM fields, then why are we going to go in the opposite direction and prepare them less for those fields than what we could be preparing them for?
In fact, I'm reading here. There's a document. It's an introduction section about the science standards, and it says implementation of NGSS will better prepare high school graduates for the rigors of college and careers. But then a little further down in the same document, it says the NGSS do not define advanced work in science. Based on review from college and career faculty and staff, they form a foundation for advanced work, but students wishing to move into STEM fields should be encouraged to follow their interests with additional coursework. So it's not included in NGSS.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not giving them a full anything. There's going to be additional stuff that they're going to have to do in order to be able to actually go into the STEM.
And from what I've been able to tell, beyond STEM, they don't teach the scientific method at all in these science standards. They've done away with that. They've done away with most of the anatomy and physiology portion of them. Where does that leave our young aspiring nurses?
Right.
And electrical systems and that.
Well,
that they teach.
yeah, And on that point, chemistry was very much lacking in these standards. In fact, I think that's one of maybe the only things that Idaho did create was a small section of chemistry to be able to teach, because there was none. There was no chemistry in any of these standards. And how can you skip out on chemistry in order to be able to have a full, well-rounded education in science? And then it was from all levels. So they literally had to create some portion of a chemistry standard to be able to implement, because there was none. And there's no talk on germs or, anything along those lines. I mean, some of the basic things that you would think of when you think science, like you're saying about the body and things along those lines, are completely left out. And it doesn't make any sense.
Not if we're trying to truly prepare our kids for some sort of science career in the future.
Right, exactly. All right, Mila, what else do we have?
Well, I think that was it. I think it was just, we really wanted to make sure that we did an overview of it, which I think we covered that pretty good. But then just to let the legislators know that it's the standards. If you want to adopt minimum standards, I guess that's one thing, but it's not your job to legislate content.
The content. And that's dangerous. I mean, that's getting into kind of a dangerous category. I wanted to add too, because I remember in some of the research I did, there were 2 other states, Rhode Island and Connecticut. And the information that came out is that Rhode Island, who adopted these same standards, the last information, it was in an article called the Providence Journal, and they reported that only 3 in 10 of the Rhode Island students were considered proficient in science, despite adopting the NGSS 3 years ago. And then Connecticut also adopted NGSS in 2016, and they saw no progress on any of their science test scores for the following years. So that is proof right there that what these are is not what they're claiming to be.
Yeah. Well, and Idaho should look at evidence.
Right.
And
if we're talking science, let's talk evidence, right? Yeah. So where's the evidence? Where is the evidence that these are going to be good standards for our students, for our kids to be able to be educated with? And the evidence that's coming out is not supporting that these are good standards, the best standards that we can get, and prepare our students for the STEM fields and whatever else that they're wanting to do within a science category. So I guess, well, we don't know if there's testimony being taken tomorrow or anything like that. We just know that there's a hearing of some sort. They kind of seem to spring these pretty quickly. We just found out about this today, didn't we? Wasn't it today?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So, all right. Anybody have any last bits of information they want to share?
Well, as far as the content goes, I know that Superintendent Ibarra at the House hearing did mention that it was rare for states to adopt the content and the standards. And so we need to keep that in mind and not go down that road, just stick to standards.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, because our whole purpose, we want the teachers to be able to teach. And if they're going to start legislating these in, then that's going to bind them in the long run. They're not going to be able to teach the way that they're wanting to actually teach. And what if things change down the road? What if we find out some new discovery, but this is what it is in law, and then they teach something else, then they're breaking the law? I mean, how does that work? So then we have a bunch of teachers that are lawbreakers. I don't think that's probably going to be a positive outlook for Idaho. So,
yeah.
And I guess one thing maybe I would just add is which of our current or former standards, where are teachers forbidden from teaching, some of these concepts that everybody's worried that we're not teaching? If were our standards really that bad before?
Yeah, I don't know. I went through the school system, the Boise school system. I have 2 kids that have graduated from the Middleton School District, and they took science classes and advanced biology, and my degree is a science degree, so I must have learned something. And they had advanced biology and different science classes that they took, and they seem to have come out, you know, with knowledge about science and understanding science. So yeah, is what we have really that bad, or is that just the narrative that's being told so that we'll do something else?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Well, anything else?
Nope.
And if anyone has any questions, we'll make sure that contact information is given out. We'll email that out, and links and whatever else. And yeah, we'll see how this all transpires. It'll be interesting.
All right. Thank you, ladies.
All right. Thank you.